For over 60 years, the X-Men franchise has entertained superhero fanatics all across the globe, from its original comic book series to cartoon appearances, including the newly released X-Men '97 on Disney+. In addition, the series carried its popularity over to movies and to video games. The first X-Men game released was The Uncanny X-Men in 1989 by, of all publishers, LJN. It wasn't successful. Paragon Software followed up with 2 PC games, both of which were an improvement. In 1992, Konami released an X-Men beat-em-up to the arcades, and it became one of the year's highest-grossing arcade games. More X-Men games came along, including a first for Capcom, developer and publisher of the Street Fighter franchise. This game was called X-Men Mutant Apocalypse, released exclusively for the Super Nintendo in 1994 to critical acclaim. That same year, Capcom also released an X-Men arcade game, X-Men Children of the Atom. The arcade game was well received, and eventually spawned ports on the Sega Saturn, Sony PlayStation, and PC. Further into the 90s, X-Men characters were featured as playable fighters in Capcom's Marvel Superheroes and Marvel vs. Capcom series. But in 1996, one game really took X-Men's foray into video games beyond its limits. It's X-Men vs. Street Fighter tonight on Gaming Delight. Capcom released X-Men vs. Street Fighter to arcades in Japan on September 25, 1996. Later that year, the game hit arcades all over the rest of the globe. It was released on the CP System 2 arcade board. In the game, you get to choose 2 of 16 characters. 8 are from Street Fighter: Ryu, Ken, Cammy, Chun-Li, Charlie or Nash, Zangief, Dhalsim, and M. Bison. The other 8 are from X-Men: Cyclops, Wolverine, Storm, Juggernaut, Gambit, Sabretooth, Magneto, and Rogue. Well, actually there are 17 characters. The 17th is a hidden character, Akuma. To play as him, highlight one of the 4 characters in the top row, then go up one more, and voila, Akuma. Now to the game. You're allowed to mix and match on the characters you choose. Good guy and bad guy, X-Men character and Street Fighter character. 2 X-Men, 2 Street Fighters, the works. Once you've selected your 2 characters, you face off against 2 opponents, one at a time. What makes this arcade game stand out is that you're allowed to tag your second player at any time during battle. The enemy AI does the same. Elements from previous Marvel fighting games from Capcom were implemented into this game, such as a super jump, giving you the ability to jump higher than usual. There's also the aerial rave, allowing you to perform combos while airborne. This game in particular also features the Hyper Combo gauge, which fills up with every move you make and the damage you take. Once it fills up to level 1, you can perform your Hyper Combo. Fill it up to level 2 and you can perform the variable combination, allowing both of your characters to attack at once. A successful hit may wipe out half of an enemy's health bar. And speaking of the health bar, after you take damage, you'll notice that the damage you take is represented by a red shadow. So if you should tag out, you'll have time to recover that lost health while your teammate continues the fight. But the healing comes to a complete stop once you tag back in or your teammate is knocked out. Another combo, Variable Counter, in which tagging while defending from an attack allows the teammate to counterattack the opponent. The final boss of this game is Apocalypse, an X-Men antagonist. And by golly is he massive. It's going to take some serious tagging and hyper combos to beat this beast, but once you do, you have one last battle to contend with. A battle between the characters you choose. The one you play as is the one that landed the final blow against Apocalypse. Upon release, X-Men vs. Street Fighter received high praise. In their November 1st, 1996 issue, Game Machine listed the game as the most successful arcade game of the month. Its success in North America wasn't quite big initially, but by June of 1997, popularity rose. In its 95th issue, Electronic Gaming Monthly pointed out that as the months passed, the game was being played more often than games like Tekken 3. The popularity in Japan was enough for Capcom to begin porting the game to home consoles. In a press conference in November of 1996, Capcom announced that X-Men vs. Street Fighter would be getting a port exclusively on the Sega Saturn. But having released ports of their arcade games that were more popular on the Saturn than the Sony PlayStation, and some ports even released exclusively on the Saturn, Capcom was facing accusations of favoritism. But I seriously doubt that favoritism had anything to do with this decision. The fact that the Saturn had more power over the PlayStation made it clear that Capcom could do better on Sega's 32-bit platform than on Sony's. Regardless, Sega's market share in the West was diminishing as a result of the early launch of the Saturn in North America, while the PlayStation's popularity increased, mainly on account of the system's lower price point and heavy emphasis on 3D gaming. That's when Capcom decided to rescind their announcement and port the game to both the Saturn and the PlayStation, stating that both would be arcade perfect. That was easier said than done on the 32-bit platforms. The PlayStation and Sega Saturn, out of the box, had 2 MB of RAM each. To port X-Men vs. Street Fighter to either platform would require serious compromises. Luckily, the Saturn's RAM was expandable. Sega had already released a 1 MB extended RAM cartridge, which expanded the Saturn's capabilities, but X-Men vs. Street Fighter required more. That's where the 4 MB extended RAM cartridge comes into play. This cart is required to run numerous games. X-Men vs. Street Fighter became the very first Sega Saturn game that would require the 4 MB RAM cart. This, and several other games that did, would come bundled with the cartridge. The same could not be said for the PlayStation, so numerous omissions were made, such as removing the tag team combat and disabling the ability to switch characters at any time, and therefore reverting to the original best-of-3 format. X-Men vs. Street Fighter was released for the Sega Saturn on November 27, 1997 in Japan, and only in Japan. The PlayStation version was released on February 26, 1998 in Japan, June 11, 1998 in North America, September 24, 1998 in Australia, and November 6, 1998 in Europe. In Japan, the PlayStation version was marketed as the EX edition to deviate it from the Saturn version. I don't have the PS1 port, but you get the idea on how poor it is compared to the Saturn and arcade versions. So, although PlayStation fanatics demanded a port for Sony's platform, they ended up getting a worse port than they anticipated. Oh, the irony! Anywho, let's check out the Saturn port.
Optic blast. X-Men vs. Street Fighter!
Now, the Saturn port isn't perfect, considering its animation sprites had less frames, but that was small potatoes compared to the speedy gameplay and simple tag team battle mechanics. With the help of the 4 MB RAM card, there's virtually nothing to distinguish the Saturn port from the arcade original, other than an options menu which lets you adjust the difficulty, the audio, the turbo speed, the time limit, the button configuration, and more. An automatic hyper combo gauge refill is added if you beat the game undefeated without losing either fighter. With that option, you can refill your gauge automatically. But fair warning, the enemy AI might see this coming. Once you beat the game in any way on the Saturn, you'll be given a few extra privileges. You're allowed to choose the same character twice. New colors will be unlocked. Pressing C or Z will access them. More turbo speeds are added, up to 8 stars, along with 2 negative speeds, represented by diamonds. After you lose a match, if you press Start and the LR buttons on your controller on the Continue screen, you can continue without having to go back to the character selection screen. Quite a few YouTubers like GameSack and Sega Lord X really got me into this game. It's thanks to them that I was able to pick up a copy for my Saturn, and boy was I impressed having playing it myself. My first playthrough, I chose Cammy and Wolverine, my all-time favorite characters of their respective teams. Now, don't get me wrong, I had no issue playing as 2 Street Fighter characters as well. I also find the health bars refilling while on standby really satisfying. It's pretty helpful if you want to beat the game undefeated and unlock the hyper combo option. But sometimes, even on the lowest difficulty level, these tag team battles can be cutthroat. Some projectile attacks can be a pain in the butt. Take Storm's Typhoon, for instance. Her tornado-like projectiles make me think of Gainit's from the King of Fighters series, and his Kokodeska moves. And as usual, it takes a lot of precision to get the hyper combos down pat. But overall, X-Men vs. Street Fighter is truly one of the Sega Saturn's best 2D fighting games. It also makes my top 10 list of favorite Saturn games overall. Hell, it makes the top 5! But those are just my opinions. Here's another YouTuber who might feel the same way.
Street Fighter II was, to me, like many others, a seminal game. It wasn't just that it defined my closely knit friend group for years as we tried to dominate our local mall arcade against whatever challengers might walk in the door, but it was also the game that helped me overcome my long-running Sega favoritism and admit that, I guess, maybe I needed to get a Super Nintendo. So after the deluge of 2D fighters of the early to mid-90s, fans started to wonder if the genre was becoming stale. 3D fighters were really starting to come into their own with Virtua Fighter 2 and Tekken 2 making strong impressions on everyone who saw them in action. Maybe this really was the future of fighting games. I mean, it sure seemed like it, until I walked into the arcade one day and saw absolute mayhem playing out on a screen of a brand new X-Men vs. Street Fighter arcade cabinet. As someone weaned on the precise, almost chess-like action of Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat 2, I couldn't even tell what was going on. Characters were swapping in and out like crazy, and screen-filling energy beams were being tossed around like it wasn't even a big deal. It's like Capcom saw those 3D fighters and set out to make a game so fast and chaotic that there was simply no way that anything in 3D could even come close to doing this kind of stuff. Asserting themselves as the veterans of the fighting game scene, Capcom stared directly at Namco and Sega and said, "Oh yeah? You think you can do this?" X-Men vs. Street Fighter was a statement that there were still possibilities with 2D fighting games. Or, heck, with 2D sprite-based video games in general. I don't think that I truly witnessed a arcade-perfect port until X-Men vs. Street Fighter was released on the Sega Saturn in Japan. With the help of the 4 meg RAM cart, load times were nearly invisible, and no sacrifices had to be made on the animation front. The selected 4 characters could be tagged in and out at will, without any sort of hitch in the gameplay. On the other hand, the PlayStation 1 version was a complete disaster. In 1998, X-Men vs. Street Fighter was the first game I ever imported from Japan. I don't know if it was the raving I saw on the pages of Game Fan magazine, or, I don't know, encouragement from within whatever IRC chat room I was frequenting at the time. I just knew I had to have it. And, you know, the Saturn was already down for the count in the US, so I was able to get one used from Electronics Boutique for a fraction of its launch price. Importing X-Men vs. Street Fighter, along with an Action Replay cartridge that doubled as a region mod and 4 meg cart, definitely cost more than the system I was going to be playing it on. And did it live up to my expectations? You better believe it did.
Upon release, X-Men vs. Street Fighter on the Saturn was well received. In North American publications, it was reviewed as an import. GamePro gave the graphics a 4.5 out of 5, with the fun factors, sound, and control each getting a perfect score. They referred to it as, quote, one of the most fun fighting games ever to hit the home market. Game Informer declared it one of the best arcade conversions ever seen to date. This success led to Capcom planning a Western release of the game. However, the 4 megabyte RAM cartridge was never released outside of Japan. The Sega Saturn was already on its last legs in North America, and Sega of America didn't feel like releasing a peripheral for a console with a small user base. Capcom would have had to have made their own 4 megabyte RAM cartridge and bundle it with the game. Unfortunately, by the second quarter of 1998, major retailers began clearing their stock of Saturn hardware and software by discounting them significantly, giving further doubts to Capcom. Ultimately, X-Men vs. Street Fighter for the Saturn never saw a Western release. Instead, video game stores like Babbage's and Electronics Boutique began selling imports of the game, as well as region-unlocking cartridges with extra RAM like the Action Replay Plus. It was a neat way to collect for the Saturn once Sega of America pulled the plug on the platform. The system remained popular in Japan, despite the impending release of the Dreamcast. If I'd only known back then. But sadly, my eyes were on the Nintendo 64. After the Saturn and PS1 ports, we never saw a re-release of X-Men vs. Street Fighter on other consoles. Disney owns Marvel, thus they own the rights to the X-Men characters. So as much as I'd like one for the Switch, Capcom would have to go through some legal hurdles to actually port the game to modern platforms. Today, you can find a complete copy of the Saturn version of X-Men vs. Street Fighter with the 4MB RAM card for up to $100 on eBay. But if you want it with the RAM card, you're going to need a Japanese console or a modified North American or PAL console. With an Action Replay Plus, you won't need the RAM card or to mod your console. If you want the PlayStation version, the Japanese version is the way to go. The Western versions go for over $100 complete. Overall, if you haven't picked up X-Men vs. Street Fighter, I say get on it. It's a hell of a great fighting game, especially if you're playing it on MAME or the Sega Saturn. Thanks again for watching Gaming Delight. Until next time, happy gaming!